Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our fourth and final skip event of 2018. Gosh, I'm wishing time away. This is a particularly meaningful event for myself because this is actually the culmination of over a year's worth of research that WMG have conducted in conjunction with JDA. One of the reasons why it's a joy to work with JDA is they're very open-minded in terms of approaching work like this as a research project. And so what we hope we can actually give you are some genuine insights into this slightly hypey topic of digital supply chains or supply chain digital readiness, and actually show you where Europe is at according to the 179 manufacturing companies that we surveyed. So I should begin as well by just positioning this within the broader landscape of digital within WMG. So I obviously sit within the dynamic supply chains pillar of our digital landscape, but WMG has a broad remit in the digital space, and I think we're fairly unique. I'd probably argue we may be one of the only universities in the UK, particularly a university that within one department can actually offer support and advice from looking at intelligent devices and machines, the way in which we use digital technology to support effective and efficient manufacturing, looking at the way we use technology to support connected products and services, and pulling all of this together, the way in which that creates new innovative business models. And we also have a range of competencies that enable us through this landscape to deliver sustainable results. But this evening is firmly on that dynamic supply chain space. I'd also ask you, if you tweet, I think that's a bit passé these days and people use Instagram or other forms of social media, use which you like, but please do join in the discussion because we do try to capture these things. Alas, Storyfy is no more, but we do try to capture the tweets as part of the capstone page for our events. So I'm going to begin by asking you guys a question. So what do you think a digital supply chain actually is?
Connected.
So connected. Any other views? Digital supply chain.
Information transparent.
Information transparent, so it gives you visibility.
Live data.
So live data, so we've got real time, it's visible, it's connected. Anything else?
It should be action orientated, so not just collecting the data, but then acting on that data and turning it into an action. That's responsive.
So I think they're all great insights, and just as I think digital supply chains have yet to be fully defined, and what you're perhaps describing are some of the attributes of how they perform. Supply chains have been around since 1982, and actually most organisations can't agree on a definition of a normal supply chain, let alone a digital supply chain. And I think the critical message here is we have a view that we're going to share with you, but going forward, I think a critical first step in your digital journey is to make sure your organisation understands what it means by the term digital supply chain. And it doesn't matter necessarily if it's different to another organisations, as long as you've got an understanding and you then, as appropriate, can begin to share that with the rest of your supply chain. So we started by trying to think about this needs to be actionable, yeah? So if we want it to be actionable, it actually needs to link into some of those core supply chain processes that exist within our business. And we started to think of it from a score perspective, but actually what we identified is 11 core processes that we were going to look across to assess supply chain digital readiness. We then also, and I'll just ask Hans-Jörg to augment, but we also wanted to look at 4 different maturity levels.
Thanks, Janet. So roughly we looked at describing a maturity model along 4 stages in order to allow companies assess themselves where they currently are and where their aspiration is. So this is a high-level description of the starting point which we used, where level 1 stands for visibility, level 2 stands for a predictive supply chain, level 3 is then prescriptive, telling you actually what to do, and level 4 with autonomous self-learning kind of autopilot mode. Now, in order to do a fair assessment by the 11 core processes we have identified, we obviously needed a little more detail and meat to these high-level descriptions.
So what we then did is identify a number of sub-dimensions. So essentially what we identified were the sub-dimensions of planning frequency. So we were looking at something that was ad hoc, that was going to be regular with some unplanned changes, or something with regular and appropriate planning cycles with alerts if business conditions changed, or something that just had continuous planning with response to change in real-time business conditions. We also looked at the strategic objective, and this one for me is perhaps one of my personal favourites because it sort of sums up what we're trying to do. So are we just looking at visibility to support departmental reporting? Are we actually looking at level 2 to be efficient and to support functional optimisation? Or can we make it to that sort of slightly holy grail of things where we're actually trying to get dynamic and end-to-end supply chain optimization? But fundamentally, your businesses are out there to make money. So can we actually use our supply chain digital readiness to actually support that holy grail of end-to-end business optimization? However, in order to do this, as a digital space, we're looking at how we adopt technology to do this. So are we just looking at having basic processes that are supported by ERP systems, and maybe we've got a relatively manual S&OP process that can support that? Or are we actually at the second level starting to use some specialist tools and professional techniques and actually augmenting that with some process automation and maybe even using some supply chain segmentation? Or have we actually moved on to the next level where we're actually using things like machine learning, AI and digital control towers? We have a mature integrated business planning process, and we've actually got connected and professional supply chain tools. Or have we moved to that fourth stage where we're using technology to create a fully digital process where we've got extensive use of machine learning and AI and where things are autonomous where appropriate? That's that action level, but we also need to look at reporting and analysis. Businesses like to know how they're doing. So are we in a situation where we've got limited analytics and we're using a lot of Excel? I won't ask you to put your hand up if you're in that box. Or are we actually using analytics tools that we can use for reporting on key metrics and to support that functional sort of cost optimization? Or are we more in the space of using advanced analytics and we're moving away from deterministic models to more probabilistic analytics, and we actually have real-time alerts that tell us if we need to do something different? Or are we in a system at level 4 where we've got autonomous adjustment within defined parameters with real-time escalation where required? Now, we took this model and then developed it. So if you can imagine, for each of the 11 processes, these were populated with the data for each of the 11 processes. And that's the survey that we sent out across Europe. We were really, really pleased with the response. We got 179 responses, which was a really good representative sample. 73% of our respondents were senior managers or execs. 64% of our companies had a turnover of more than 100 million. There was a very broad range of different manufacturing types of industry and a really, really good geographical spread. And we were most intrigued to find that actually we got the highest response from Italy. Though we believe there may have been some kind of government incentivisation around showing that you were doing something in the digital space to support that. But if any of you know the reason why, please tweet and let us know. But this was our first survey where Italian response was higher than British. So what did we find? And many people actually want to know the reality rather than just the hype. And the reality is, probably not surprising really, that only 13% of the companies we surveyed were at that level 3 level of digital readiness. So that was only about 13%, to put it in context, that were actually managing to achieve something like end-to-end supply chain optimization. The majority of organisations in Europe are currently at level 2, which means they're primarily focused on functional optimization. They're using some specialist tools to use their ERP, and they're beginning to use analytics to support their decision making. However, the good news is that by 2023, so in 5 years' time, the ambition is to more than double the level 3 digital readiness to around 31%. Now, what I'm not going to do this evening is take you through all 11 dimensions one by one, because we may not have many of you awake at the end of that. So we've got some summaries that perhaps look at things in this sort of spidergram format. But one of the things when we looked against those 4 subdimensions that we could see, if you look where the gaps are the biggest, or between current and future, there are 2 areas where we've seen the biggest ambition to improve. The first was around digital technology adoption. So there's a real appetite, I think, to try to use digital technologies to try to overcome some of those inhibitors that have stopped us turning relatively basic supply chain theory into practice. I mean, come on, let's be honest, supply chain theory probably hasn't changed in the last 30 years, yet we're still struggling to do the basics. So can we use technology to help us leapfrog over that gap? And the second was around planning frequency. So I think there is this real desire, or there seemed to be this real need to move from that sort of backward looking in the rear mirror, seeing what's going on behind us, to actually being able to get real data in real time to actually make decisions about the future. And so they're the 2 areas where we can see the greatest ambition to change. And so what we've done is try to reflect upon those learnings and actually give you some ideas for how you might go about improving your own supply chain digital readiness. We thought that was perhaps more useful than presenting every process one by one. And actually what this means is that you need to adopt a 3-speed approach. It's a 3-speed approach, but we've sort of turned it into a 2x2 because you need to address the technology, the business model, and the process challenge, but there's 2 aspects to the process challenge. One is around looking at your supply chain core business processes, so those 11 processes we talked about and how you use technology to improve those. But the second is by taking the supply chain business process orientation and actually thinking about how you use digital technologies to improve that. And what we're now going to focus on is giving you some insights around each of those 4 areas that support those 3 challenges. So the first is looking at supply chain as a core business process. So my question to you is, what do I mean by business process, do you think? Why am I making this distinction between supply chain core processes and supply chain as a business process?
Because you should see the whole business as your supply chain. Everything is covered end to end, everybody within it, and all processes and behaviours.
Yeah.
It's your entire business.
It is. And just a stepping stone to explain why that is the difference between a sort of functional process and a business process. It's about the difference between focusing on making an individual function better or your end-to-end supply chain, and it's the difference between the end-to-end supply chain process sucks up those functional resources. These are some organisations that you could argue look very, very old, so catalogue companies, who have actually used technology to actually revolutionise actually their core functional processes. So how long do you think catalogue companies have been around?
1870.
Yeah, they've got their origins in the late 1800s. And they are a business that, if you can imagine, at their peak, were producing something like 25 million catalogues a year, and the internet and digital technologies have enabled them to massively reduce that and actually take their business to the next level. What do you think? So at the core of a catalogue company's success has been the way that they've developed their core business process, their core supply chain processes. And actually one of the most amazing processes that they've developed links to which aspect of operating a catalogue company? Do you have any idea? So what do you think is the problem with selling things online? Or one of the big challenges of selling things online?
It's actually tangible.
Product returns. So one of the big issues, if you're an online retailer, is returns. And actually people have discovered with the catalogue companies that the most profitable companies are actually the ones that return the most. Profitable customers are actually the ones that return the most. So actually, what companies like this have got really good at is their returns process. And actually what they can do is actually allocate stock that's in the returns process to another order. And they can do that for a very, very high percentage of their orders. So a very high percentage of their orders are actually allocated to stock that is actually in the returns process. And this is because essentially they had a process, a business that was made up on functional core supply chain process excellence, which when the internet came along and digital technologies came along, they were able to take to the next level. Yet they're a very traditional and not particularly sexy looking business, some may argue. Because fundamentally, many businesses are now organised around the SCORE model, plan, source, make, deliver, return, and good organisations are trying to look at those processes from at least their customer's customer to their supplier's supplier. But when we actually looked at the maturity against our 11 processes, so we took SCORE and broke it down into a little bit more detail to make it a bit more actionable, what we actually saw was that current level of maturity is around level 2, but actually within 5 years, ambition pretty much is still within that level 2. And what we're actually looking at for most of those processes is about a half a level improvement or development in their digital maturity. Which you could argue, God, that's not very ambitious, or that's not such a big improvement. If you actually go back to those descriptors we had, this is the difference from being able to optimize a function to being able to optimize your end-to-end supply chain. This is that difference between functional optimization and end-to-end supply chain process optimization. And fundamentally, let's think about it. If you come from a large multinational organisation, you have a legacy business. A bit, maybe it hasn't been quite around quite as long as some of the catalogue companies, but you've got very embedded ways of working. And actually, when it comes to trying to change those core supply chain processes, it takes time. And actually, because of the size of your business, it can be very, very difficult to actually enact that change. So actually using technology to actually improve your core supply chain processes is a really, really sensible first stage, because what you're actually doing is creating that bedrock of operational excellence that your business can then leverage. And when we looked at these processes, as I said, there's quite a lot of detail. What we actually found is that factory planning and scheduling was the process with the highest level of digital readiness at the moment, but it was also the business that by 2023, that's the process that people actually thought was going to be most able to respond to a real-time change in business conditions. Interestingly, and given that in supply chains there's quite a lot of emphasis on this process, sales and operations planning, it was the process with the lowest current level 3 for planning frequency, and it was only going to increase to about 48% within 5 years. So this is sort of saying that for a process that we see as so critical and has had a lot of attention, it's perhaps one where ambition to get to those higher levels is perhaps more stilted than for other processes. If we were then to look at the strategic objective, so this is essentially why are we doing this? Is it about visibility? Is it about functional optimization? Is it about end-to-end, supply chain end-to-end, business optimization? Interestingly here, network design was the process where we seem to have the greatest strategic ambition. And this for me is really interesting because we've been doing some research looking at this difference between what we call dynamic flexibility, which is the ability to flex up or flex down volume to changes in demand, to something called structural flexibility, which is the ability to fundamentally change the centre of gravity of your supply chain to either a good event or a bad event. So it's about changing your network design. And for me, this was surprising because this was sort of suggesting that maybe organisations are beginning to wake up to the importance of a more dynamic network design. So this showed seeds of actually not just supply chains digitising, but perhaps actually becoming more dynamic. And actually by 2023, over 20% of businesses believe that their network design capability will enable end-to-end business optimization, which is quite encouraging. Here again, though, we started to see that sales and operations planning was a process where the ambition was perhaps a lot lower than we'd expect. It's certainly not the process I would have expected to see, perhaps a lower ambition around level 3 and level 4. But in terms of digital technology and adoption, it's this more customer-facing process, so again, perhaps not surprising, of allocation planning and order promising that had the highest ambition to adopt digital technology. So maybe when we start to see this connectivity to the customer and actually how we fulfill those orders to the customer, we actually see that technology can be a real enabler in helping us transform that interaction. And last but not least, when we start to look at digital reporting and analytics, it's allocation order promising and allocation planning and order promising again that has this higher ambition, which again, if your customers are king and we're trying to develop demand-driven supply chains, it would make sense that perhaps the area we put most emphasis into gaining that insight is at that end of our business. And once again, I slightly despair that S&OP seems to be the area where organisations perhaps things are going to be a bit more difficult. So when we asked people about what technologies they're using, and it wasn't surprising that at the moment, most of the technologies that people are using are actually to support their data infrastructure. So it's stuff that helps them get data. The next tranche of technologies that people are using are things that create a new data source. So stuff that's going to help them get more data. So when we reflect upon this, essentially we think there's 5 steps that you can go through to actually start to improve your supply chain core process optimization. The first is to continue to build that data infrastructure. Some of your organisations probably have quite disparate systems that don't necessarily talk to each other, and that backbone of your business isn't particularly joined up. So the first thing to do is to make sure that you can get hold of data. Then what you can do, and this is where we're seeing the use of things like sensors and IoT, is actually improve your data capture. But make sure you're capturing data that's relevant, not just data for the sake of it. So quite a lot of organisations may look at external sources for data, say, I'm going to look at social media or other external sources. I'd actually argue start with the data within your own business that can help you actually improve your own core supply chain processes. And once you've got that working well, then you could consider more sophisticated data sources. And then what you can do, once you've got a good data pool, you can actually then start to improve your data analytics capability to get better insights from that data and turn it into actions. And what this will help you to do is to sustain your legacy business, because what it's going to do is help you create a bedrock of operational excellence built on functional excellence. And if you think about the metrics within your businesses at the moment, many of them are about actually driving that functional excellence. And you need that functional excellence to come on to the next step, which is about building that supply chain business process excellence. And you may just want to comment on this, because this shows the step change in the way that you can use digital technology.
So what we've noticed through the responses and applying our maturity model we jointly came up with is that the new normal has moved on. What traditionally was good enough maybe 10 years ago, like statistical forecasting in a deterministic approach, which if you took it to a meaningful level of detail, was quite sophisticated already. For the future going forward, in the digital age, it's no longer good enough. That's now probably a level 2 capability around your core supply chain processes. Now, and the simple reason for that is that businesses have become more complex. Customers have become more demanding, and a lot of organizations already start talking about supply chain segments of one. Now, if you apply thoroughly the segmentation principle, and I suggest you go and read our previous joint survey and study on that subject. If you take this serious, then you end up at a much higher level of granularity and data points that you need to steer your business towards. Now, that more or less automatically exclude the old way of working in a deterministic approach, because you can't calculate for all time slots, all segments, by same or similar forecasting algorithms, let's say, yeah? Or on the fulfillment side, similarly, to support different fulfillment models as part of your segmentation strategy, you need to teach your supply chain, which was built up towards doing the same highly efficient at higher volumes. You need to teach that old dog supply chain new tricks in dealing with modern customer and consumer demand. We talked about the return flows. This is completely unknown, more or less, to efficiently being handled through different channels than previously, because it was never ever the setup these supply chains were built towards. Now, our take on this is based on the maturity levels we defined, that new technologies such as machine learning and artificial intelligence, moving away from the deterministic approach to a probabilistic approach, offer an opportunity in leveraging these kind of technologies to solve the big data challenge. If you are going down to segments of one, and you add on external data sources like we have seen with IoT and sensor networks and point of sale and what have you, you triple, quadruple, whatsoever the amount of data you're dealing with. So you need to apply a fundamentally different approach in doing so in order to solve that maze. I think that's the core essential of that.
And so whilst I would argue that you need to use digital technologies to optimize your functional processes, that you'll still be at a level of maturity if you do that. And we want to help you move on up to level 3. And this is why you need to start thinking about supply chain business process optimization and that difference, as we started to talk about, between core processes and business processes. And Andrew's quite right that one of the critical things is this end-to-end perspective. But there are more than one supply chain, there's more than one business process, and there are actually a number of characteristics which define a business process and make it different from a functional process. The first of these is they have customers for who they create value, so they start right at the point of customer demand. Secondly, is they typically cross cross-functional boundaries, so they are trying to span more than one function within your own entity, but potentially multiple entities within the supply chain. And the clever thing that I touched upon earlier is that they draw upon functional resources. So that process or functional excellence is absolutely critical, because then these business processes can draw upon them. They tend to be team-based because you're having to bring those different functions together, and they will have a strategic goal. Now, can you think of any of examples of what you think could be business processes? So supply chain is obviously one. Could you think of, there's two other common business processes?
The procurement?
So that would come under end-to-end supply chain. The other two are actually new product development, which actually is probably the business process that most organisations have invested most time and attention in. And the other one is customer relationship management, which again, by its nature, has had focus. So why, if those business processes have had focus and attention, have we not put attention and focus on our supply chain management core business process? What, yet again, it's that poor relation. the only organisation that I actually know that has adopted this as an org structure, they had a fourth business process which was about brand management, but they were a fast-moving consumer good organisation. And so, again, leveraging our work from 2016, and I'm now coming back a little bit to your question on sales and operations planning or integrated business planning. I came from organisations that were very product biased. So I worked for a pharmaceutical company and I worked for Dyson. You know, product innovation is absolutely cool, but they're perhaps slightly skewed towards their product strategy. A good business, and I'd argue that businesses like McDonald's, like Aldi, they have a much better balance between their product, their marketing and their supply chain strategy. They keep them in alignment. And once they've got their strategy in alignment, they use their integrated business planning process to make sure those processes stay aligned. And that supply chain management process is your way really of deploying your supply chain strategy. And what it essentially supports within your business is a strategic value discipline of operational excellence. Now, businesses compete, they can compete through operational excellence, and actually in Porter's generic strategies, that's seen to be cost leadership. But Tracy and Weissima, they extended sort of Porter's view of the world, and they said, yeah, you can have cost leadership and differentiation, and you know, at the surface, that's the way that most organisations do compete. But if you actually think about it, you can differentiate yourself in two ways. You can differentiate yourself by either being very close to your customer, having good customer intimacy, or you can differentiate yourself through actually having innovative products and services. And you know what? Yeah, okay, you're probably going to compete either through cost leadership or differentiation, but we would actually argue in terms of your value disciplines, you may have one that's the one that you compete through, but you actually have to be threshold or good enough in the others. So actually, I really like this idea of the value disciplines, and we used it in our 2016 survey, and we used it again here, just to see if we gave a company 100 points, how would they divide those out between those three value disciplines? And interestingly, we've seen virtually no change that actually operational excellence is the bedrock of most organisations, because fundamentally you have to have your costs under control, you have to have your basics in place to give you that management headroom to then compete and differentiate your business through product leadership or customer intimacy. Now, what I would actually expect to see as we move away from just selling pure products to a more servitised business models is that we actually use digital technologies to really help us harness that customer intimacy. So, not that I'm a great prophet, but I would expect that over time, I expect the operational excellence bedrock to remain, but we see a shift between the degree to which companies are actually competing through product innovation and customer intimacy, because I think as we move to more servitised business models, that customer intimacy becomes more critical. But we are yet to get there. We're still pretty much today in the same position that we were in 2016. And fundamental to this, just leveraging some of the results again from our 2016 survey, part of the reason for this is that if you want to create end-to-end business processes, the organisations that I've seen that have done it, they have their classic matrix structure of functions and regions, but on top of it, they have a separate organisational layer in their business that actually is a business process layer. And it does suck the functional resources out. It has very senior level support, and it's all about creating end-to-end flow. On top of that, they tend to have metrics, so everyone in the organisation is incentivised on a balance of functional, customer-facing and business-facing measures. It's much more balanced. All too often, a classic matrix structure only really supports smart targets or very, very functionally orientated targets, and they drive functional silos. So we have a real opportunity to really harvest the potential of digital technologies to bring these end-to-end business processes to life, to support a slightly different org structure and to support a different type of metrics to support us operating in this way. But actually, unfortunately, even though IBP is the single most important governance mechanism for any business, it is the one where we had was one of our lowest performing current dimensions. And what we actually think is that some organisations may be beginning to feel S&OP fatigue. They've kept trying to do it, and it's really, really hard, and it's not working. And so they feel slightly weary, and therefore their ambition is perhaps lower than it should be. And that it could be, because I actually do believe that we could use digital technologies to help us leapfrog and overcome that impasse by using it to help us maintain this strategic alignment and support the creation of supply chain as a business process. But it is probably going to require a change in organisational design. So coming on to the third area, and these are not mutually exclusive. We'd actually argue you should be doing all three of these. This is about how we actually use supply chain digital technology in more of a pilot format. And what we can see, and Hans-Jörg will give some really good examples in a couple of minutes, is organisations creating a safe space in their business where they actually trial technologies. And what we'd actually encourage you to do is to trial as many technologies as safely as possible. Find those safe havens within your business where you can nourish these new technologies. And one of the things you need to think about, if it's a pilot, you're not expecting them all to work. But what you're looking to see, because none of us have crystal balls and know how something will work out, is if we apply these technologies to processes within our business, how will they work out? Because interestingly, what we did see within our survey is that over the next 5 years, the adoption of AI is expected to double. And after that, we're going to see increase in the use of sensor networks, Internet of Things, robotics, and computer-aided process and planning.
Now that result is kind of surprising a bit, and on the other hand, it is not. I mean, artificial intelligence is a subject that you kind of can't avoid bumping into. Yeah? It's all over the place, wherever we go, whatever we read, it has to have something to do with artificial intelligence. Now, we would see that probably it is more realistic or even more likely that companies will explore in pilot mode some easier to handle technology such as machine learning first, and taking that learning curve then further on than into artificial intelligence. And this is something that was not indicated by the survey, as machine learning technology was ranked much, much, much lower than artificial intelligence. So everyone is hyping after the Big Bang thing, but I think for practical reasons there might be some intermediate steps that are much more reasonable and value add for organizations, rather than going for the big fish first, which might be a too big fish to swallow at first hand. Yeah? I mean, and this is all what we are proposing with regards to trying things out in pilot mode on safe ground, take the learning back to the organization, because it is a fundamental difference coming from a deterministic world where a forecasting algorithm was exactly calculating by the unit, by the day, on what the number actually is, exactly. Yeah? Now with the probabilistic world, where we look at deviations and behavior characteristics, the math works completely different, and the results coming out of such can no longer be directly back calculated. So that's a learning for many organizations to build the level of trust and ownership for such things and open up new learnings from that. And I'm going to show you 2 examples of such.
Just one quick question on that. Are you including process automation as machine learning, or not at all?
We didn't split it out that explicitly in our definition of the maturity model, but from my personal perspective, RPA is something different, as it is repetitive task automation, which for me has very little to do with intelligence. Yeah? So therefore, yes, these are kind of process robots that can help you automate things, but someone has to tell these things what to automate and how. So it's different. Yeah? Okay, back to the maturity model we used with some of the examples here. So again, the 4 levels: visibility, predictive, prescriptive, and autonomous autopilot mode. We see certain processes evolving at certain steps, and these are typical when your organization might actually be different in some of these. So in the first step, S&OP is used to create visibility on where the organization stands and where the organization is heading from a sales and operations plan, profitability, revenue, and all those good things. All make sense. Now, the next level we typically see is the introduction of segmentation to boost corporate profitability, because not everyone in our segments deserve same service level. You have to have some differentiation. Some customers and some channels are always more important than others. Why should you treat everyone the same? So that is the next fundamental step that we see in predictive stage. Then in prescriptive, we see the emergence of digital control tower, getting visibility that goes beyond the 4 walls of the own enterprise. That gives you more insights in inbound and outbound supply chain. In transit is the most asked function or process domain to be looked into with a control tower, then leading into level 4 autopilot mode, where for known problems and known resolutions exist, why should that not be automated? And that could indeed be with RPA. Yeah?
So very, very quickly, what we thought is that you need to de-risk the way in which you use technology. And so this is a modified version of the old chestnut, the Ansoff matrix, that we sort of adapted for technology adoption. Because fundamentally what we'd argue is that if you've got a current capability, unless you're going to create a total separate entity where you can play around with different business models, it's actually quite dangerous to do new technology, new way of working simultaneously. Plus the fact you won't actually know if it works. If it works, you don't know whether the success was the new way of working or the new technology. If it fails, equally, you don't know whether it failed because the new way of working wasn't good or the technology wasn't good. So what we'd suggest actually is that you move forward on 2 fronts. You should take your current capability and potentially use current technologies to look at new ways of working. And at the same time, you could be actually looking at your current way of working and use new technologies to see if you can improve that way of working. Once you've proved either of those, that then becomes your new current capability and you can add on the extra step. Why we believe that's important is if you want to move beyond pilot to full justification, you have to have a business case. And so what you want to actually understand is what's giving you the improvements. And I'm going to hand over to Hans Jorg now, who's going to give you 2 examples of how this has worked in practice.
Thanks, Janet. So both examples I'm going to talk about are from the automotive sector. The first one is a digital control tower project we delivered at Mercedes-Benz for the NAFTA region. Yes, there has been some renaming recently of that, but for me it's still Canada, US, and Mexico, right? So for the brand Mercedes-Benz, providing a premium service level to their appreciated customers is key. And given their stretched supply chain with most of the spare parts coming from the central DC in Germany, visibility was key into their inbound supply chain, which parts are in which container, on which vessel or aircraft towards their distribution centers. And not only that, it was also about predicting any kind of impact, such as weather. I mean, if you move around parts within a country like UK, weather is probably not so critical. There can be also incidents where snow starts falling, where traffic breaks down, but it's a total different dimension if you look at a stretched inbound supply chain going over the pond. Then you will want to know the expected time of arrival, taking into consideration weather forecasts to see if this is impacting the route the vessel is on and potentially delaying stuff. Now, the visibility step immediately would be for about any organization is to put sensors on all of the containers to know where stuff is. Actually, if you're looking at a supply chain of that scale, that won't help you. Because you're ending up with something that I would call a Starship Enterprise boardroom, where you have thousands of lights flashing at you and you have no idea which lights you need to pay attention to. Yeah? So you need to have a clever mechanism to filter out noise that is just telling you the stuff is where it is expected to be at that point in time, so it's no news. It's actually the prediction then 3, 4, or 5 days out if a port congestion or close down because of weather is causing the trouble, and then you can take corrective actions already in advance before it actually happened to you. Yeah? And many visibility control towers show you when things did go wrong. Okay, you end up firefighting the same way as you do today. The trick really is to look into the future, to prevent things from happening as long as you can. Next example is also in the automotive space. That's tires business, where for a European supply chain network consisting of many different factories, distribution centers, and dealer network, and using very traditional, high sophisticated planning tools for many, many years with highly skilled people, there was still a threshold in terms of service level that this organization could not go beyond, because they did see service level failures where they did not expect it to see. And I'm not talking about those very obvious cases where forecast was off. I mean, if your forecast for a certain type of tire size region combination was 1,000 and your actual sale request was 1,200, okay, guess what? Chances are you're short by 200. That's not what I'm talking about. Huh? And Michelin felt that with the deterministic approach, they had reached the maximum business performance. Now they took then the technology pilot approach, applying machine learning algorithm to find patterns in their European operations network that humans could not detect. And this is what we built with them based on their own big data, plus eventually point of sale information from the tire dealers whenever that was available, to then build a user interface that made the results explainable to the users. Because that's another fundamental change compared to the tools we are all used to work with for the last two decades, maybe. Because machine learning, you can't detect or reverse math. When you open the HUD, to stay in the car example, and you take a look at the engine, you can probably work out as an engineer how this engine works. With a machine learning thing, you can open as many HUDs as you want. You will not figure out how exactly this thing has learned stuff and how it is actually making the prediction. Now with traceback, to a certain extent, you can shed light on how the machine learning algorithm actually detected that particular pattern. But once you've proven out what it is, you simply apply the operational data from current week to predict service level failures 2-3 weeks out. And that was the trick at Michelin, to train the machine learning algorithm with a half year, full year of operational data set, let it learn patterns that humans could not detect, to then use actual data and the reverse logic to predict service level failures 2-3 weeks out, when it can still do things about it. And to the interesting finding of that organization, the machine learning algorithm did find plenty of patterns and incidents that were clearly predictable, that were never detected before. Yeah?
So the last area is around new business models. And what we suggest here is that you seriously need to think about this, because the manufacturing landscape is changing beyond all recognition. So we are in a world that within the developed economy, our sort of consumption-driven way of driving economic growth is being questioned because of the social and environmental consequences of that consumption-driven economic growth. And if we look at it, we see, and quite often I go to conferences where those themes are split out, but fundamentally we're in a world where we're moving from buying products to services, and that's possible because we now have technology that enables us to better put a package around a product to deliver it as a service. So that's where IoT, Industry 4, big data analytics, call it what you like, actually enables those new business models. But it also helps to support us actually keeping things in their highest possible value state for longer. So it actually supports different business models that support the circular economy and sharing business models. And this is also driving a change in the manufacturing landscape in terms of where our supply chain assets are. We're moving away from potentially very centralised, globalised networks to much more distributed networks that have many, many different points. So that sort of dynamic network design that we mentioned earlier. And as I said, that we actually found, and this supports this argument, that redistributed manufacturing argument will have a very, very different manufacturing footprint than the one that we currently have. And therefore, we're beginning to see early signs this is being picked up because, as I said, people are recognising that network design and having that dynamic network design capability is going to be critical to supply chain success. And so what we need to see your businesses being is more like speedboats. And to create a speedboat mentality, if you're in an oil tanker, probably means you need to set up a separate business. And this is what we're beginning to see. Very, very large organisations setting up spin-offs or separate business units so they can play without being constrained by the oil tanker that they come from. And this often leads to separate business models. So HP, they still sell ink in the traditional way through supermarkets or other normal distribution channels, but equally you can buy instant ink, a subscription-based service where you pay a set amount per month and you're guaranteed never to run out of ink. The ink comes to your home, it's IoT enabled, so IoT monitors your usage, it sends the new ink when you need it, and they incentivise you to actually return the ink when you've finished with it. So this is a new business model that's been created. It runs as a separate business unit that is IoT enabled, is servitized, supports the circular economy, and actually has a more distributed manufacturing network because the recycling is all done for Europe in Paris. And so my challenge to you is, have you set up your speedboat? Are you beginning to experiment and create new business units a bit like instant ink? And so just to conclude,
so what we've seen is, in order to harvest the digital dividend, you need to do certain things in a different way than you probably traditionally did. The things that you thought of in the past of being superior or giving you differentiation is a commodity today. So you need to think ahead and try out new things in order to stay competitive and deal with the ever-growing amount of big data that is going after you. Yeah? If you are not harvesting the digital dividend Euro competition will do. And there might be digital native organizations out there who you are not considering as competition yet, that are perfectly dealing with these new technologies and will embark in your domain quite easily without having the operational excellence. Because customer intimacy and these kind of capabilities will become eventually more important than traditionally operational excellence was. So my 3 key insights here from the report you have in your hands, very simple. We've seen broad coverage of the digital subject and high interest in taking the survey on digital readiness across many different countries and many different subverticals in manufacturing. So for me, that means digital is a mainstream subject. Second, yes, the ambition to improve may appear from first sight a little demotivating or less ambitious. But if you look at who actually took the survey, the natural conclusion would be that probably many people are practitioners, same as you, and probably taking a pragmatic approach towards what they believe today is possible in their organizations. As Janet rightly said, it's difficult to turn an oil tanker into a speedboat. And if you're at the bridge of an oil tanker, you probably don't even see the waterline where to place the speedboat. So that makes it kind of difficult to imagine what that would actually be. And then thirdly, I talked about that a bit earlier in here. For organizations, it might be hard to figure what these new technologies such as artificial intelligence and eventually machine learning mean to their business. It all sounds very fancy, very sophisticated. No one really understands how this thing works. How should it be applied to my business so it's not screwing up everything? Yeah? And that's essentially the mitigation we are proposing here with the 3-speed approach to improve in all 3 dimensions and piloting things in a meaningful way.
So from my perspective, and it really builds on what Hans-Jörg said, so I fully concur with the 3-speed approach. However, the process challenge, I'd argue, has these 2 levels. You need to consider both the core process level as well as the business process level, and also think about the technology challenge and the new business model challenge. So you have to take that 3-speed approach. And what this actually means in practice is that first things first. Most of you probably work in oil tankers, so therefore you must harness that opportunity to take the digital technologies to actually create that bedrock of operational excellence and improve your core supply chain processes. If you do that, you then create a solid platform from which you can start to actually organise your business. So this probably does mean you need to change your organisational structure to create that additional business process layer. You may need to also introduce new metrics to support that way of working, but what that will enable you to do is to move up to level 3 and actually get end-to-end supply chain optimization. You also need to design your business for end-to-end business optimization. The first thing you need to do is not give up on integrated business planning and maybe use technology as an enabler to help get over that impasse that many organisations seem to be at. But then use that technology, experiment as much as you can in that pilot phase. Experiment as much as you can, fail quick, see where you're successful quick, and if you're successful, scale quickly. But equally, don't feel scared if you have got an oil tanker business to set off some speedboats and actually think about how you can create different organisational structures that do enable you to actually experiment with new business models. And that could actually require you to get new people. Because one of the biggest issues I think we have as we look to Industry 4 is that without meaning to, we look at Industry 4 through an Industry 3 lens. So how do we find the people that can enable us to look at Industry 4 through an Industry 4 lens? Thank you very much.